She refused the divorce and vanished. 30 years later, the shocking truth is revealed, as told by Detective Sarah Williams, retired, Franklin County Sheriff's Department. My name is Detective Sarah Williams, and in my 35 years with the Franklin County Sheriff's Department in Ohio, I've worked thousands of cases. Robberies, missing persons, domestic violence, you name it, I've seen it. But there's one case that has haunted me for 3 decades, a case that challenged everything I thought I knew about human nature, family loyalty, and the lengths people will go to protect the ones they love. It's the case of Margaret Maggie Catherine Bennett, who vanished without a trace on October 15, 1994, just 2 days after she told her husband she would never, ever give him a divorce. For 30 years, we believed Maggie Bennett was the victim of foul play, probably domestic violence that escalated to murder. We were wrong, dead wrong. The truth, when it finally came to light in 2024, was so shocking, so completely unexpected, that it made national headlines and forced me to question every assumption I'd ever made about missing persons cases. This is that story, the real story, told for the first time by someone who was there from the beginning. Let me start at the beginning, back in 1994, when I was just a 32-year-old detective with 8 years on the force and a reputation for taking domestic cases seriously, at a time when a lot of my colleagues still considered them family matters that didn't require real police work. The call came in on a gray October morning from Robert "Bobby" Bennett, a 43-year-old insurance salesman who lived in a modest 2-story house on Maple Street in downtown Franklin. His voice was shaking when he told the dispatcher that his wife hadn't come home the night before and that her car was missing. "She never stays out all night," he kept repeating. "Something's wrong. Something's really wrong." When I arrived at the Bennett house around 10 a.m., Bobby was pacing his front porch like a caged animal. He was a small man, maybe 5'6" and 160 pounds, with thinning brown hair and nervous eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Not the physical type you'd immediately peg as dangerous, but I'd learned early in my career that appearances can be deceiving when it comes to domestic violence. The first thing Bobby told me was that he and Maggie had been having marriage problems for months. He wanted a divorce, she didn't. They'd had what he called a big fight 2 nights before she disappeared, and she'd made it crystal clear that she would never agree to end their marriage. "She said she'd rather die than divorce me," Bobby explained, wringing his hands. "But I didn't think she meant it literally." That phrase, "I'd rather die than divorce you," would echo in my mind for the next 30 years. Margaret Bennett was 41 years old, 5'4", with shoulder-length auburn hair and green eyes. According to Bobby, she worked part-time at the Franklin County Library and spent most of her free time volunteering at their local Catholic church, St. Mary's. They'd been married for 18 years and had no children, which Bobby said was a source of ongoing tension between them. "Maggie always wanted kids," he told me that first day. "The doctors said there was no medical reason we couldn't have them, but it just never happened. She took it harder than I did, I guess. Started getting more and more religious, spending all her time at that church." The missing person report painted a picture of a woman who was deeply unhappy in her marriage but absolutely unwilling to end it. Bobby described her as obsessed with the sanctity of marriage vows and convinced that divorce was a mortal sin that would damn her soul to hell. "She'd quote scripture at me," Bobby said. "Kept saying, 'What God has joined together, let no man put asunder.' She'd rather make us both miserable forever than break her vows to God." The initial investigation seemed straightforward, if depressing. Maggie Bennett had disappeared on the same day she was scheduled to meet with Bobby's divorce attorney, where she was supposed to be served with preliminary papers. Instead of showing up for that appointment, she'd simply vanished. Her 1991 Honda Civic was found 3 days later in the parking lot of Riverside Park, about 10 miles outside of Franklin. The car was unlocked, keys still in the ignition, her purse on the passenger seat with her wallet and ID intact. There were no signs of struggle, no blood evidence, no clues about where she might have gone or what might have happened to her. We interviewed everyone who knew Maggie. Her co-workers at the library described her as quiet but friendly, always willing to help patrons find what they were looking for. She'd seemed more stressed than usual in the weeks before she disappeared, they said, but she hadn't talked about her marriage problems with anyone at work. The people at St. Mary's had a different perspective. Father Michael O'Connor, the parish priest, told us that Maggie had been coming to confession more frequently in recent months, and that she'd asked him repeatedly about the church's position on divorce and remarriage. She was clearly struggling with something, Father O'Connor said. But the sanctity of the confession means I can't tell you what she discussed with me. I can say that she was a woman of deep faith who took her marriage vows very seriously. Maggie's sister, Linda Patterson, lived in Columbus and hadn't spoken to her in over a month before the disappearance. When I interviewed her, Linda was hostile and defensive, clearly blaming Bobby for whatever had happened to her sister. He was trying to force her into a divorce she didn't want, Linda said. Maggie would never abandon her marriage or her faith. If she's gone, it's because he did something to her. But Bobby Bennett didn't fit the typical profile of a wife killer. He was cooperative with our investigation, submitted to multiple polygraph tests, which he passed, and genuinely seemed devastated by his wife's disappearance. His story about wanting a divorce was corroborated by multiple sources, including his attorney and several friends who said he'd been talking about leaving the marriage for months. More importantly, Bobby had an airtight alibi for the night Maggie disappeared. He'd been at a company conference in Cincinnati with dozens of witnesses, including his hotel room neighbor, who confirmed that Bobby had been in his room all night, talking loudly on the phone with someone until almost 2 a.m. The phone records backed up his story. Bobby had indeed spent hours that night calling Maggie's cell phone, leaving increasingly desperate voicemails begging her to come home and talk to him. The calls stopped at 1:47 a.m., presumably when Maggie's phone battery died or she turned it off. We found her cell phone a week later, thrown in a dumpster behind a Walmart 15 miles from where her car was discovered. The phone was damaged but still functional, and our tech team was able to recover the voicemails Bobby had left. They were exactly what you'd expect from a worried husband, pleading, apologetic, increasingly frantic as the night wore on. But there was one voicemail that didn't fit the pattern. The last message Bobby left at 1:45 a.m. was different from the others. His voice was calmer, more resigned. "Maggie, I know you're listening to these," he said. "I know you're angry and hurt, and I'm sorry for that. I never wanted to hurt you. But I can't live like this anymore, and neither can you. We both deserve to be happy, even if it's not with each other. Please come home so we can figure this out like adults." After that message, nothing. Maggie Bennett had effectively vanished from the face of the earth. The investigation continued for months. We searched the woods around Riverside Park, dragged the nearby river, followed up on dozens of tips from people who thought they'd seen Maggie in various locations around Ohio and neighboring states. Every lead turned into a dead end. The case officially became a cold case after 18 months, though I never stopped thinking about it. There was something about Maggie Bennett that stuck with me. Maybe because I was a woman in a male-dominated profession and could relate to feeling trapped by circumstances beyond your control, or maybe because her disappearance felt so deliberate, so planned, despite the lack of evidence supporting that theory. Over the years, I'd periodically revisit the file, looking for something I might have missed. I re-interviewed Bobby Bennett several times as he moved through the stages of grief, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and eventually a kind of resigned acceptance. He never remarried, never even dated seriously as far as I could tell. When people asked him why, he'd say he was still married in the eyes of God and the state of Ohio. In 2001, 7 years after Maggie's disappearance, Bobby petitioned the court to have her declared legally dead so he could collect on her life insurance policy and move on with his life. The judge granted the petition, but Bobby never spent the money. He put it all into a savings account, saying it would be there for Maggie when she came home. "She'll come back eventually," he told me during one of our follow-up interviews. "I don't know when or why, but I know my wife. She's not the type to just disappear forever. She's probably somewhere trying to figure out how to come home without losing face." I thought Bobby Bennett was deluding himself, holding on to hope that was keeping him trapped in an endless cycle of waiting and wondering. I was wrong about that too. The years passed. I worked other cases, solved some, failed to solve others. I got promoted to detective sergeant, then lieutenant. I married my partner Jim, had 2 kids, bought a house in the suburbs. Maggie Bennett became one of those cases that lived in the back of my mind, a reminder that sometimes people just disappear and you never learn why. Bobby Bennett aged visibly as the decades passed. His hair turned gray, then white. He developed a slight stoop and started walking with a cane after a knee replacement surgery. But he kept working, kept living in the same house on Maple Street, kept telling anyone who would listen that his wife was going to come home someday. In 2014, 20 years after Maggie's disappearance, the Franklin Gazette ran a retrospective article about the case. The reporter interviewed Bobby, who was then 63 years old and looked 10 years older. "People think I'm crazy for still believing she's alive," Bobby said in the article. "But I know Maggie better than anyone. She didn't kill herself, and nobody killed her. She's out there somewhere, and someday she's going to walk through that front door like nothing ever happened." The reporter asked him if he'd ever considered the possibility that Maggie had simply chosen to disappear to start a new life somewhere else. "Maggie would never do that," Bobby replied firmly. "She was the most honest person I ever knew. If she wanted to leave me, she would have said so. She wouldn't just vanish without a word." Reading that article made me sad for Bobby Bennett. After 20 years, he was still living in the past, still waiting for a woman who was almost certainly dead to come walking through his door. I made a mental note to stop by and check on him when I had time, maybe suggest he consider grief counseling or therapy to help him move forward. I never got the chance. On March 15, 2024, 30 years after Maggie Bennett disappeared, I got a phone call that changed everything. I was 2 weeks into retirement, finally enjoying the luxury of sleeping past 6 a.m. and reading the newspaper over coffee without rushing out the door, when my cell phone rang at 8:30 on a Friday morning. The caller ID showed it was Detective Mike Rodriguez, my former partner who'd taken over most of my old cases. "Sarah, you need to sit down for this," Mike said without preamble. "We found Maggie Bennett." My first thought was that they'd finally located her remains, probably buried somewhere in the woods or at the bottom of a lake. After 30 years, I figured someone had finally confessed or a construction project had unearthed evidence. "Where?" I asked, already reaching for my car keys. "That's the thing," Mike said, and I could hear the disbelief in his voice. "She's alive, Sarah. She's been alive this whole time." The story that unfolded over the next few hours was so bizarre, so completely unexpected, that it made me question everything I thought I knew about human behavior and the capacity for deception. Maggie Bennett hadn't been murdered. She hadn't killed herself. She hadn't been kidnapped or suffered amnesia or any of the other theories we'd considered over the years. She had, quite simply, chosen to disappear. But the reason why, and the elaborate lengths she'd gone to in order to pull it off, were unlike anything I'd encountered in 3 decades of police work. The discovery began with a routine traffic stop in Portland, Oregon. A 68-year-old woman named Mary Catherine Baker had been pulled over for a broken taillight, and when the officer ran her license, it came back with an unusual flag. The Social Security number had been issued to someone else decades earlier. The officer, suspicious of identity theft, asked Mary Baker to step out of the car and began questioning her about her personal information. The woman became increasingly nervous and eventually admitted that Mary Baker wasn't her real name. "My real name is Margaret Bennett," she said. "I'm from Ohio, and I've been using this identity for 30 years. The Portland Police Department ran Margaret Bennett through their system and discovered she was listed in the National Crime Information Center database as a missing person from Franklin County, Ohio. That's when they called us. Mike Rodriguez and I drove to Portland the next day to interview the woman who claimed to be Maggie Bennett. I was skeptical. After 30 years in law enforcement, I'd seen plenty of people claim to be missing persons for various reasons, usually involving mental illness or attempts to escape legal troubles. But the moment I saw her, I knew it was really Maggie. She was older, obviously, 71 instead of 41, and her hair was now silver gray instead of auburn. She was thinner than she'd been in 1994, and there were lines around her eyes that spoke of years of worry and stress. But the bone structure was the same. The green eyes were unmistakable, and when she spoke, her voice was exactly as I remembered from our brief phone conversations 30 years earlier. "Hello, Detective Williams," she said when I walked into the interview room. "I've been wondering when this day would come." The story Maggie Bennett told us over the next 8 hours was both heartbreaking and infuriating. Yes, she had deliberately disappeared on October 15, 1994. Yes, she had planned it for weeks in advance. And yes, she had spent the last 30 years living under an assumed identity in Portland, Oregon, working as a librarian and living a quiet, solitary life. But the reasons behind her disappearance were nothing like what we had imagined. "I want to start by saying that Bobby never hurt me," Maggie said, looking directly at me. "He never hit me, never threatened me, never did anything that would justify what I put him through. Bobby was a good man who married the wrong woman." According to Maggie, the problems in her marriage hadn't been caused by Bobby's desire for a divorce or her religious objections to ending the marriage. The real issue was much more complicated and painful than that. "I was gay," Maggie said simply. "I had known since I was a teenager, but in the 1970s and 80s, that wasn't something you could just be open about, especially in a small town like Franklin, especially in a Catholic family like mine." Maggie explained that she had married Bobby because it was what was expected of her, what her family and her church demanded of a good Catholic woman. Bobby was kind and stable and would provide the respectable life she was supposed to want. But she had never been attracted to him, had never been happy in their marriage, and had spent 18 years living what felt like a lie. "The reason we never had children wasn't because of medical problems," she said. "It was because I couldn't bring myself to be intimate with Bobby often enough for it to happen naturally. He thought it was his fault, or that I was frigid, or that there was something wrong with our relationship that could be fixed. He never suspected the truth." The breaking point came in 1994 when Maggie met someone who changed everything. Her name was Catherine Torres, and she was a new librarian who had been hired at the Franklin County Library that summer. Catherine was 35, recently divorced, and had moved to Ohio from California to start over after her marriage ended. "The moment I met Catherine, I knew," Maggie said. "It was like a light turned on inside me. For the first time in my adult life, I understood what it meant to be attracted to someone, to want to be with someone." Maggie and Catherine began what Maggie described as an emotional affair, long conversations about books and life, lunches that stretched for hours, walks in the park after work. They never kissed or even held hands, but both women knew what was happening between them. "Catherine was everything I had never allowed myself to want," Maggie said. "She was intelligent and funny and kind, and when she looked at me, I felt like she saw who I really was, not who everyone expected me to be." The crisis came when Catherine told Maggie that she was in love with her and wanted them to have a real relationship. She was prepared to be open about their relationship, to face whatever consequences came with being a gay couple in a small Ohio town in 1994. "But I couldn't do it," Maggie said, tears streaming down her face. "I was too much of a coward. My family would have disowned me, the church would have excommunicated me, and Bobby would have been humiliated. He was a good man who deserved better than to have his wife leave him for another woman." When Bobby told Maggie he wanted a divorce, she saw it as both a solution and a disaster. A divorce would free her to be with Catherine, but it would also require her to explain why she wanted the divorce, to confront truths she wasn't ready to face. "So I said no," Maggie explained. "I told Bobby I would never agree to a divorce, that it was against my religious beliefs. It was easier to be the stubborn, overly religious wife than to be the woman who had been living a lie for 18 years. But denying Bobby the divorce didn't solve her real problem. Catherine was growing impatient with Maggie's refusal to acknowledge their relationship or leave her marriage. She had given Maggie an ultimatum: either tell Bobby the truth and ask for a divorce, or Catherine would transfer to another library system and they would never see each other again. "I couldn't lose Catherine," Maggie said. "She was the only person who had ever made me feel truly alive. But I couldn't destroy Bobby's life either. So I came up with what I thought was the perfect solution. I would disappear." The plan Maggie devised was elaborate and, I had to admit, remarkably well executed for someone with no criminal experience. She had been secretly saving money for months, skimming small amounts from their household accounts and her library paychecks. She researched how to obtain false identification documents, something that was much easier to do in 1994 than it would be today. Most importantly, she had an accomplice, Catherine Torres. "Catherine didn't want me to disappear," Maggie explained. "She wanted us to be honest about our relationship and face whatever came next together. But when I told her I couldn't do that, she agreed to help me start over somewhere else." On October 15, 1994, Catherine picked Maggie up from the library at closing time. Instead of going home, they drove to Cincinnati, where Maggie had arranged to purchase a fake ID and social security card from a document forger Catherine had found through her ex-husband's criminal contacts in California. Maggie became Mary Catherine Baker, combining her first name with Catherine's first name and choosing Baker as a surname because it was common and unmemorable. She dyed her hair brown, changed her style of dress and makeup, and practiced speaking with a slightly different accent. Meanwhile, Catherine drove Maggie's car to Riverside Park and abandoned it there, then took a bus back to Cincinnati, where Maggie was waiting. Together, they drove Catherine's car to Portland, Oregon, where Catherine had secured them both jobs at the Multnomah County Library System and had rented a small apartment under her real name. "We were together for 7 years," Maggie said. "They were the happiest years of my life. For the first time, I was living authentically, being who I really was instead of who everyone expected me to be." But even in Portland, even with Catherine, Maggie couldn't escape the guilt of what she'd done to Bobby. "Every day I thought about him," she said. "I knew he was waiting for me, hoping I would come home. I knew I was torturing him by letting him believe I might still be alive somewhere, but I couldn't figure out how to contact him without destroying the new life I'd built." The guilt became unbearable after Catherine died of breast cancer in 2001. Suddenly alone again, Maggie was forced to confront the reality of what her disappearance had cost her husband and everyone who had cared about her. "I thought about coming home then," she said, "but it had been 7 years. How could I explain where I'd been? How could I tell Bobby that I'd been alive and happy while he was grieving for me? So I stayed in Portland and tried to build a life by myself." For the next 23 years, Maggie lived as Mary Baker, working at the library, renting a small studio apartment, maintaining no close relationships, and making no efforts to contact her family back in Ohio. She read the Franklin Gazette online and followed news about the search for her, about Bobby's refusal to give up hope, about the periodic updates in her missing person case. "Every year on October 15th, I would write Bobby a letter," she said. "I would tell him everything. Where I was, why I had left, how sorry I was for hurting him. But I never sent any of them. I kept them all in a shoebox in my closet, 30 letters I was too much of a coward to mail." The traffic stop that led to her discovery wasn't accidental. Maggie had been growing increasingly depressed and isolated as she aged, and she was tired of living a lie. She had deliberately let her car registration lapse and had been driving around Portland, hoping to be pulled over by police. "I wanted to be caught," she admitted. "I was 71 years old. I had no family, no real friends, no life worth living. I thought maybe if I was discovered, I could finally tell the truth and find some kind of peace before I died." After Maggie finished her story, Mike Rodriguez and I sat in stunned silence for several minutes. I had worked thousands of cases over the course of my career, but I had never encountered anything quite like this. A woman who had faked her own disappearance not to escape an abusive husband or to avoid criminal charges, but because she couldn't face the truth about her own sexuality. From a legal standpoint, Maggie Bennett had committed several crimes: fraud, filing false documents, using a stolen social security number. But after 30 years, the statute of limitations had expired on most of these offenses, and the prosecutors in both Ohio and Oregon were reluctant to press charges against a 71-year-old woman whose only motivation had been to live authentically. More importantly, there was still Bobby Bennett to consider. Bobby was now 73 years old and in poor health. He had diabetes, heart problems, and early-stage dementia. The news that his wife had been alive for the past 30 years and had chosen not to contact him was going to be devastating. Mike and I flew back to Ohio with heavy hearts, knowing we were about to destroy an old man's understanding of his entire adult life. We met with Bobby at his house on Maple Street, the same house where he and Maggie had lived as newlyweds, the same house where he'd been waiting for her return for 3 decades. When we told him that Maggie was alive, Bobby's first reaction was joy. His face lit up like a Christmas tree, and he immediately started asking when she was coming home, whether she was hurt, if she needed him to come get her. When we explained that she had chosen to disappear, that she had been living in Oregon for 30 years under an assumed name, Bobby's expression slowly changed from joy to confusion to something approaching horror. "She was alive this whole time?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "She let me think she was dead for 30 years? The hardest part was explaining why she had left. Mike and I had discussed how much to tell Bobby about Maggie's sexuality and her relationship with Catherine Torres. On one hand, he deserved to know the truth. On the other hand, he was an elderly man from a conservative background, and learning that his wife had been gay and had left him for another woman might be more than he could handle. In the end, we decided to tell him everything. Bobby Bennett had spent 30 years wondering what had happened to his wife, and he deserved to know the complete truth, no matter how painful. Bobby listened to our explanation in silence, occasionally asking for clarification, but mostly just staring at his hands folded in his lap. When we finished, he sat quietly for several minutes before speaking. "So she was never happy with me," he said finally. "Not ever. Our whole marriage was just a lie." I tried to explain that Maggie had genuinely cared for him, that she had left partly to avoid hurting him further, but Bobby wasn't ready to hear that yet. The man who had spent 3 decades believing his wife had been the victim of foul play was now learning that she had willingly abandoned him to live with another woman. "Did she ever think about coming back?" Bobby asked. "In 30 years, did she ever consider telling me the truth?" We told him about the letters Maggie had written but never sent, about her guilt and regret over the pain she'd caused him. Bobby asked if he could see the letters, and after checking with the Portland Police Department, we were able to have them sent to him. Reading those 30 letters was, according to Bobby, both heartbreaking and healing. Maggie had poured her heart out in those pages, explaining her struggles with her sexuality, her guilt over lying to him, her desperate wish that she could find a way to make things right without destroying both their lives. "She was scared," Bobby told me a few weeks later. "I never realized how scared she was. All those years, I thought she was just stubborn about the divorce, but she was really just terrified of facing who she was." The question of what would happen next was complicated. Technically, Bobby and Maggie were still legally married, since her death certificate had been issued based on her disappearance, not on any actual evidence of death. Maggie would need to return to Ohio to sort out the legal mess of her 30-year disappearance, including dealing with the life insurance money Bobby had collected and the Social Security benefits she had received under her false identity. More importantly, there was the question of whether Bobby and Maggie would ever see each other again. Bobby wanted to meet with her, to have what he called a proper goodbye after all these years. Maggie was willing, though she was terrified of facing the man she had put through 3 decades of wondering and waiting. The meeting took place in Portland in May 2024, with Mike Rodriguez and me serving as mediators. It was the first time Bobby and Maggie had seen each other in 30 years, and the emotion in that room was almost overwhelming. Maggie looked older and frailer than she had during our initial interviews, as if the stress of her revealed secret was physically draining her. Bobby, despite his age and health problems, looked more alert and focused than he had in years, as if finally having answers to his questions had given him renewed energy. They talked for 4 hours, covering 30 years of missed life, unspoken truths, and mutual regrets. Maggie apologized repeatedly for the pain she had caused, while Bobby struggled to understand how the woman he thought he had known so well had been carrying such enormous secrets. "I wish you had trusted me enough to tell me the truth," Bobby said at one point. "I would have been hurt, but I would have understood eventually. You didn't have to disappear." "I know that now," Maggie replied. "But in 1994, I couldn't see any other way. I was so terrified of being rejected, of losing everything, that I convinced myself running away was the kindest option for both of us." By the end of their conversation, both Bobby and Maggie seemed to have found a measure of peace. They would never be able to reclaim the lost years or undo the pain that Maggie's disappearance had caused, but they could at least move forward with honesty and understanding. Bobby returned to Ohio and immediately filed for divorce, something he probably could have done decades earlier if he had chosen to have Maggie declared dead. The divorce was finalized in August 2024, exactly 30 years after Maggie's disappearance. Maggie remained in Portland, but she legally resumed using her real name and began the process of straightening out her financial and legal affairs. The Social Security Administration and IRS were surprisingly understanding about her situation, allowing her to pay back the benefits she had received under her false identity without pressing criminal charges. The story of Maggie Bennett's disappearance and return made national headlines for about a week before being overshadowed by other news. Most of the media coverage focused on the unusual nature of her disappearance and the length of time she had remained hidden, rather than on the deeper issues of sexuality, marriage, and social acceptance that had driven her to such desperate measures. But for those of us who had worked the case, the story raised profound questions about the assumptions we make about missing persons, about the pressures society places on people to conform to expected roles, and about the lengths people will go to avoid facing painful truths about themselves. In my 35 years as a detective, I had seen people disappear for many reasons: to escape abusive relationships, to avoid criminal prosecution, to start over after financial ruin, to hide from dangerous enemies. But I had never seen anyone disappear simply because they couldn't face the truth about who they were. Maggie Bennett's case taught me that sometimes the most dangerous person in someone's life isn't a spouse or a criminal or an enemy. It's the person they see in the mirror every morning, the person whose expectations and judgments they can never escape. The real tragedy of this case isn't that Maggie Bennett was gay in an era when that was difficult to accept. The real tragedy is that she was so convinced she would be rejected and abandoned if she told the truth that she chose to reject and abandon herself instead. Bobby Bennett died peacefully in his sleep on December 3, 2024, 8 months after learning the truth about his wife's disappearance. He was 73 years old. According to his obituary, he had spent his final months reaching out to old friends and distant relatives, rebuilding connections that had been strained by his decades-long obsession with Maggie's disappearance. His funeral was well attended, with many people commenting on how much happier and more peaceful he had seemed in his final months, as if finally having answers to his questions had freed him to live again, even briefly. Maggie Bennett attended Bobby's funeral, sitting in the back of the church and leaving immediately after the service. Several people recognized her, but no one approached her. It was, according to witnesses, both the first and last time she had set foot in Franklin, Ohio, since her disappearance 30 years earlier. Today, Maggie Bennett is 72 years old and still lives in Portland, Oregon. She continues to work part-time at the library and has become involved with local LGBTQ+ organizations that support seniors who came out later in life. She gives occasional interviews about her experience, hoping that her story might help other people avoid making the same mistakes she did. "I spent 30 years hiding from the truth," she said in a recent newspaper interview. "I hurt people I loved because I was too scared to hurt them with honesty. If my story can convince even one person to choose truth over deception, then maybe some good will come from all the pain I caused." As for me, I retired from the Franklin County Sheriff's Department in March 2024, just days after Maggie Bennett's identity was confirmed. Her case was, in many ways, the perfect bookend to my career, a reminder that human nature is far more complex and unpredictable than any manual or training course can prepare you for. I still think about the case sometimes, usually when I'm reading news stories about other missing persons or watching true crime documentaries with my husband. I wonder how many other Margaret Bennetts are out there, people who have chosen to disappear rather than face difficult truths about themselves, leaving behind families and friends who may spend decades wondering what happened to them. The case also changed how I think about cold cases and long-term missing persons investigations. We had always assumed that if someone was missing for decades, they were either dead or being held against their will. We never seriously considered the possibility that they might be living normal, peaceful lives under assumed identities, too ashamed or afraid to come home. How many missing persons cases might be solved if we expanded our thinking about why people disappear? How many families might find closure if we were more willing to consider that their missing loved ones might have chosen to leave? These are questions that don't have easy answers, but they're worth asking. Because sometimes the truth, no matter how painful or complicated, is better than a lifetime of wondering and waiting. Margaret Maggie Bennett refused to give her husband a divorce and then vanished for 30 years, leaving behind one of the most puzzling missing persons cases in Franklin County history. The truth, when it finally emerged, was more complex and heartbreaking than anyone could have imagined. But it was still the truth, and sometimes that's the most important thing of all. Detective Sarah Williams retired from the Franklin County Sheriff's Department in March 2024 after 35 years of service. She now lives in suburban Columbus with her husband and works as a consultant for cold case investigations. This account represents her first detailed public statement about the Margaret Bennett case. Margaret Bennett continues to live in Portland, Oregon, and has become an advocate for LGBTQ+ seniors and issues related to late life coming out. She requests privacy regarding her exact location and current activities. If you have information about other long-term missing persons cases, please contact your local law enforcement agency. Every missing person deserves to be found, and every family deserves answers.